Hey everyone, welcome back. This is part 2 of chapter 2, and we're going to finish off chapter 2 in the lecture material, the handouts. Let's take a look here. Last time we left off, we were talking about electronegativity, and what I had told you was that electronegativity is an atom's attraction for electrons in a covalent bond, and I told you that electronegativity increases. If you look at the periodic table, electronegativity is increasing as you look from left to right on the periodic table, and it's increasing from bottom to up, right? And don't forget that electronegativity increases by large amounts when you're going toward the right, but it only increases by small amounts when you're going upwards. And don't forget the other thing I told you, that carbon and hydrogen have roughly the same electronegativity. So when they share bonds, when carbon and hydrogen share electrons in a covalent bond, they're actually going to be sharing those electrons evenly because carbon and hydrogen, again, they have roughly the same electronegativity, the same attraction for electrons. That's going to result in a nonpolar covalent bond and a nonpolar molecule. All right, so let me show you what water looks like. We talked about this in the last video. Water has an oxygen with two hydrogens, and notice how the oxygen has, remember that small Greek letter D I told you about, delta minus, so it has a partial negative charge here. And look at the hydrogen has a partial positive. This hydrogen also has a partial positive charge, right? Now, what you need to understand is this is called a polar covalent bond for that reason. It has a partially negative pole and two partially positive poles here. Okay, and if you recall, polar molecules and nonpolar molecules do not mix. Do you guys remember that polar molecules and nonpolar, like oil and water, do not mix? And you'll come to understand why that is in a minute. Well, first of all, let me show you something. Let me show you this real quick. This is a water molecule here, and actually it's flanked by 4 other water molecules. You see, this is 5 water molecules. And notice that the water molecules are polar. And remember, the hydrogen on this water molecule has what charge? It has a partial positive charge. Well, how is this water molecule going to interact with this water molecule up here? So look at the water molecule in the middle. This hydrogen has a partial positive charge. Okay, well, look at this water molecule at the top. It's oxygen. The red part's oxygen. Its oxygen has a partial negative charge. And what you need to understand is opposite charges are attractive to one another. Okay, negative charge is attracted to a positive charge. A partial negative is attracted to a partial positive. So this water molecule is going to stick a little bit to this middle water molecule. Okay, they're going to kind of stick to one another. Why are they sticking to one another? Because partial negative, partial positive. This is called a hydrogen bond. And do you know how you denote a hydrogen bond? How you designate a hydrogen bond? Do you see these dots? When you see dotted lines like this, that's a hydrogen bond. And look at this water molecule at the bottom right. Look at this water molecule. Its slightly negative oxygen is interacting with this slightly positive hydrogen. Okay? Does that make sense? Again, opposite charges are interacting, in this case again, with a hydrogen bond. Here's another hydrogen bond, hydrogen bond. So what you wouldn't see is, like, for example, the hydrogen from this water molecule wanting to interact with the hydrogen from this other water molecule, because then partial positive would be trying to interact with partial positive. And remember, like charges repel, opposite charges attract. And do you see the dotted line? That's called a hydrogen bond. So let's go back to this. A hydrogen bond forms when oh, by the way, it doesn't have to be hydrogen. I don't know why they wrote this here. When a hydrogen atom covalently bonded to one electronegative atom is also attracted to another electronegative atom. I actually don't really like this definition. The definition you should really go with is a hydrogen bond forms, like this guy. A hydrogen bond forms when a partial charge is attracted to another, either partial charge or full charge. So what do I mean? I'll show you both. I'll show you both. Here's an example of water, which is a polar molecule. Remember, water has a slight negative charge and slight positive charges on the hydrogen. Here's water interacting with another molecule, another polar molecule called ammonia, NH3. NH3. This is another polar molecule. So can we understand why it's polar? Can we take a side note here? Side note time. Why is NH3 polar? Well, let's go back to this periodic table of elements. Remember I told you about this periodic table of elements? Let me show you something. Let me get my marker here and explain why ammonia is polar. So you've got ammonia, NH3. Remember, nitrogen has how many valence electrons? Well, it's the fifth one from the left. So it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 valence electrons, right? And NH3. So here's a hydrogen which brought an electron to share. Here's a hydrogen that brought an electron to share. And here's another hydrogen that brought an electron to share. Okay, so this is called NH3 or ammonia. And is this a polar molecule or a non-polar molecule? Well, let's look at the periodic table. Look at the periodic table with me real quick. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Look, do you guys remember what I said? When you're going upwards on the periodic table, the jump in electronegativity is negligible. It's really tiny. But when you're going toward the right, the jump in electronegativity is really big. So hydrogen is here. Nitrogen's over here. Which one's going to be more electronegative? Which one's going to be greedier for electrons? Well, again, if anytime you're going to the right, you're getting a huge jump in electronegativity. So nitrogen is actually quite a bit greedier for electrons, quite a bit more electronegative than hydrogen is. So look at this. Go back to our board. Nitrogen is going to be electronegative. It's going to be hogging these electrons from the hydrogen. So if you're hogging electrons, and remember electrons are negatively charged, you're going to start becoming partially negatively charged. So the nitrogen is partially negative, and the hydrogens become partially positive. Some people ask, why do the hydrogens become partially positive? And let me explain that. When you have, an atom, remember what an atom is? An atom is an uncharged element. And why is it uncharged? Because for every proton plus charge, you have an electron minus charge, and that makes you neutral, right? But what if I'm hydrogen and I should have a plus charge and a minus charge, a proton, an electron? But what if my electron starts getting hogged by something? What if my electron starts getting pulled away from me? Then what do I have left? I have left a proton, you see? So I start feeling positive because I have my proton. So anyway, I hope that helps you to understand what that means. So ammonia is a polar molecule because the nitrogen is more electronegative than the hydrogen, so it has a greater pull on those negatively charged electrons, which gives it a partial negative charge, leaving the hydrogens with that partial positive charge. So polar molecule it is because it has polar covalent bonds. So let's go back and look here. Here's water, which is a polar molecule, interacting with ammonia, which is a polar molecule. And does it make sense how they're interacting? Look, the partially positive hydrogen on the water interacts with the partially negative nitrogen on the ammonia. And do you remember what the dotted lines denote? The dotted lines denote a hydrogen bond, which is simply defined as a weak interaction between two partial charges. Okay, so here's the thing. You guys heard that polar molecules like water can dissolve polar molecules or charged substances, but what can water not dissolve? What doesn't mix with water? Oil. And that's because oil, those molecules are non-polar. Water will not interact with non-polar molecules. But look here on this board, look here on the PowerPoint, water will mix with anything that has a charge. That's what you need to understand. Water will mix with anything that has a charge. And because of this, because it mixes, ammonia can dissolve in water. You see? Ammonia can dissolve in water because it has a charge. And what if there was another water molecule over here, down here? You see here? What if there was another water molecule over here? How would it interact with the with the hydrogen on this ammonia? Well, the hydrogen from the water wouldn't want to interact with the hydrogen from the ammonia because they both have a partial positive charge. It would be the oxygen from the water. The oxygen from the water would form a hydrogen bond with the hydrogen from the ammonia. Okay, so what else can mix with water? Remember, anything with a charge, let me show you here, anything with a charge can mix with water. In this case, look at sodium chloride. Do you remember what sodium chloride is? It's salt. And when you put sodium chloride or table salt into water, the table salt gets dissolved, right? And what you can see here is why table salt gets dissolved by water. Look, sodium is actually sodium cation, right? It's a positively charged sodium ion. And water knows how to mix with this ion. What part of the water molecules are sticking to the sodium, are mixing with the sodium? Notice how it's the partially negatively charged oxygens that are forming those bonds with sodium. And what kind of bond is forming here between oxygen and sodium ion? What do you think? What kind of bond is forming here between those partially negatively charged oxygens and sodium? And that's called a hydration shell, by the way. You don't need to know that, but this is called the hydration shell. What kind of bonds are forming? Those are actually also called hydrogen bonds, right? So they could have zoomed into this and drawn those little dotted lines to denote a hydrogen bond between this oxygen on the water molecule and the sodium ion. Okay, so this is why I don't like the definition. I don't like the definition that hydrogen bonds have to involve a hydrogen, because here's an example where they don't involve a hydrogen. This hydrogen bond is between oxygen on water and sodium cation. So what you need to understand is this, okay, just real straightforward. When you have a partial negative charge on one molecule and you have a partial positive charge on another molecule, then you draw those little dotted lines. That's a hydrogen bond, which is a weak interaction between these partial charges. But you can also have a partial charge, like a partial negative, and you could form a hydrogen bond with a full-on positive charge, like this example I just showed you. The partial negative would be on the water molecule, oxygen, and the positive charge was on sodium cation. Or you can have a partial positive interacting with a negative charge. Either way, all of these are examples of hydrogen bonds. By the way, look at this real quick. What's an ionic bond? An ionic bond is when a positive charge interacts with a negative charge. So if I have sodium cation with chloride anion, that's an ionic bond. That's a strong form of bond in chemistry. So what are hydrogen bonds? You can think of hydrogen bonds as very weak versions of an ionic bond, right? Instead of the bond between a full positive and a full negative, you have a weak bond between a partial negative and a partial positive, or a partial negative and a positive, or a partial positive and a negative. All of these are weak. All of these are weak. Okay, so you can think of hydrogen bonds as super weak versions of ionic bonds. So look here, water also dissolves the chloride anion because look, the partially positive charged hydrogens on the water molecules are interacting with the negatively charged chlorine called chloride anion, and they are bringing it into solution. This is why water is great as a solvent. It is great at dissolving things, especially things that are what? Things that are polar or charged. Polar molecules or charged ions are easily dissolved by water. But what can water not dissolve? What can water not dissolve? Water cannot dissolve non-polar molecules. This is something that you need to understand, and here's why. Look, let me show you why water cannot dissolve non-polar molecules. Let's say you are, I don't know, methane. Do you remember methane? CH4, methane. Well, do the hydrogens have a partial charge? Does the carbon have a partial charge here? No. And the reason for that is because hydrogen and carbon have about the same electronegativity. Remember, we talked about that before. So there's no reason for anyone to be hogging electrons. So everyone's got their protons and their electrons, and everyone's sharing evenly. And there's no reason for any, partial positive stuff to be going on here, partial negative. No kind of poles are going to form here because you're sharing evenly, okay? Now, remember what water does? Water is oxygen with two hydrogens. Do you remember that? Water has a partial negative charge on the oxygen and partial positive charges on the hydrogens. How would water interact with, or you could think of it as, how would water stick to methane? What part of methane would water want to stick to? Well, here's the thing. Water only knows how to stick to you if you have a negative charge, because the partially positive hydrogens can stick to a negative charge, or if you have a positive charge, because the slightly negative oxygen would like to stick to anything with a positive charge of some sort. Does methane have a charge to it at all? No, methane has no charges of any kind. So water doesn't know what to do with methane, right? Water doesn't know how to stick to it. And if water can't stick to you, water can't dissolve you. Does that make sense? So this is why non-polar molecules and polar molecules don't mix, because to mix you have to be able to stick to one another. Does that make sense? Form hydration shells and whatnot, like I just showed you with sodium chloride, or also with ammonia that I just showed you a little bit ago as well. So what you need to understand is polar molecules and non-polar molecules don't mix. Have you ever heard oil and water doesn't mix? Have you ever seen that in action? Like vinegar is a polar molecule and oil is a non-polar molecule, and you got salad dressing. Vinegar always separates from oil, or oil and water always separate. Why is that? Well, water or vinegar is polar, and guess what oil is? Guess what oil is? Oil is just a really long molecule. It's actually a quite complex molecule, but it's almost entirely made up of carbons and hydrogens. Does that make sense? Like, have you heard of oils and fats and waxes and things? Have you heard of those things? Those are called hydrocarbons. You know why they're called hydrocarbons? Because they have mainly hydrogen and carbon. And any molecule, no matter how big it is, if it's mainly carbon and hydrogen, it's most likely going to be non-polar, because remember, carbon and hydrogen share those electrons evenly, and there shouldn't really be a reason to have a partial negative or a partial positive charge anywhere. So oils, fats, waxes, these things don't mix with water, but it's because they're just really big molecules of carbons and hydrogens, and they're going to be sharing the electrons evenly. They're going to be non-polar. They're not going to want to mix with polar things like water. So hopefully you understand that. I know it's quite challenging to really grasp, but give it a shot. Try to wrap your brain around that, because once you understand that, you really do understand fundamentally why water does not mix with oil and other non-polar molecules. So let's take a quick little break. I've been talking for a little while straight. Let's take a quick little break, and we'll come back and finish off chapter 2. Break time. Hey, welcome back everyone from break time. Let's go ahead and keep going. So where we left off, I was about to enter this concept of water. You guys know what water is. We've needed to drink water since we were born. Even during gestation, we've needed water. In fact, all life requires water. Water is inextricably tied to life. Living things need water. That's why one of the first things we look at when we look at living on another planet like Mars, for instance, is does this planet have water? So why is water so important? Well, water has a number of very, very important properties. First of all, most of your body's weight is water, and without water, the proteins and the enzymes and all the other parts of your cell couldn't function correctly. That's one thing, but what other properties are there in water? Well, first of all, did you guys notice before we talked about water and how water sticks to other water molecules with these hydrogen bonds because water is polar? Well, this is called cohesion, by the way. Let me find this term down here, cohesion. Cohesion is water molecules sticking to other water molecules because of hydrogen bonding. Okay, and this is responsible for things like surface tension. The reason why a needle can float on water or a water strider can stride across the water without sinking. This is surface tension caused by cohesion, water stickiness to itself. By the way, there's another term you should know, and this is called adhesion. This is water molecules sticking to things other than themselves. For example, if this is a beaker here, this is a beaker of water, and you've also put a capillary tube inside of the water, you'll notice something, and that is that the water starts creeping up the glass. You see, so you'll see water creeping up the glass on the beaker. You'll also see water creeping up the glass in the capillary tube. What is that? By the way, do you guys know what this is called when water smiles at you when it's glass, inside of glass? That's called a meniscus. That's called a meniscus, right? Water always forms this curve when it's inside of glass. Why is that? Well, because of adhesion. Water molecules are actually sticking to glass. And adhesion means water molecules sticking to other polar molecules besides themselves. So water is actually stickier to glass than it is to itself. So what could you say? You could say the adhesion of water to glass is actually greater than the cohesion of water to itself. And this is why you get things like a meniscus. In fact, there are some substances on Earth that form an inverse meniscus, a meniscus going the other way in glass. For instance, have you guys seen mercury thermometers? Well, if you look at a mercury thermometer, the mercury is actually smiling at it's actually not smiling, it's frowning at you, right? It's forming a frowny face. Why is it curving the other way? Well, because mercury's cohesion to itself is greater than its adhesion to the glass. Okay, so water is sticky to itself, that's cohesion. Water is sticky to the glass, that's adhesion. Okay, and do you remember what water does when it's flanked by other water molecules? It forms all of these hydrogen bonds, okay? And this actually helps to explain why ice floats. So what do we know about the North Pole, the South Pole, where it's cold? You guys know at those poles that ice floats. So you got icebergs or little chunks of ice floating around. You know why that is? That's because ice is less dense than water. So solid water is less dense than liquid water. And why is that? Well, here's look at this image here. I know it's kind of hard to see, so we can try to zoom into it a little bit. Okay, look at this. Liquid water, the water molecules are kind of bumping into one another. They're moving so fast that all of those hydrogen bonds, remember these hydrogen bonds here? The hydrogen bonds that water wants to make, it can't make all of them because the water molecules are moving around so fast. They're kind of all together. And by the way, do you guys know what density means? Density means, for example, look at this circle. Number of water molecules inside of this circle would be a good representation of density. If you have more water molecules, you have more water molecules inside of this circle, that's more density of water. If you have less water molecules inside of this circle, that's less density of water. So density is simply number of molecules inside of a given volume. So when water is liquid, those water molecules are bumping into each other. They can't space out and make all of the nice hydrogen bonds they want to make. But what happens when water cools down? What happens when water gets cold? Look at this over here. water, when those water molecules cool down, those water molecules get to spread out a bit and form all of the nice hydrogen bonds with one another that they want to form, and form this geometric shape, and it forms a crystal. A crystal is just a repeated it's like a geometric shape that's repeated, okay? And this takes a lot less space than water does, because liquid water, those water molecules are hitting each other. They can't spread out enough to form these shapes, these crystals. Because of that, water is less dense when frozen. Water floats. And why is that important? Well, if you go to the North Pole or South Pole, it might seem like the ocean's frozen over at parts, but guess what? If you get out of your truck and you drill a hole into the ground, into the ocean, you can go fishing because there's plenty of water underneath, a certain amount of ice. You could pull out fish. You could pull out all kinds of sea life out of that ocean. If water was more dense when frozen, then all the ice would form at the top. It would sink to the bottom, and pretty soon at those poles, you couldn't have life because the oceans would freeze over, right? So it's an important property of water. We're just discussing properties of water. And what was the other important property of water? We touched on this before, but water's ability to dissolve things, right? Look, here's water dissolving sodium chloride. Water dissolves salt. This back here was water dissolving ammonia. Okay, so water's great at dissolving things. They used to call it a universal solvent, but I don't think that's a good term, because water is a great solvent. It can dissolve polar molecules. It can dissolve ions, okay? But what can it not dissolve? It cannot dissolve non-polar molecules, right? Like hydrocarbons. Anything with a bunch of hydrogens and carbons. Water can't dissolve it. Oils, fats, waxes. Those are all made up of mainly carbon and hydrogen, and water will not be able to mix with it. So water's not a great solvent for those things, but water is a great solvent for anything charged, like sodium ion, chloride, right? Anything charged, anything polar. Okay, what else do we need to know about water? Look at this. This is another very important property of water. It has to do with pH, okay? It has to do with pH. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time in this video talking about pH, but I want you to click this icon here at the bottom left, because I've put together, I think it's a 15 or 20 minute long video where I go in depth about pH. And, in the interest of time, I don't want to do another 20 minutes added to this video saying the same thing. So you may want to click that to watch in detail what pH is. But what I need you to, this would be great if you really want to understand how pH works. But what I really need you to know from that video for our reasons, for our test, is that only at pH 7 does water, at pH 7, you have the same amount of protons, hydrogen ions, as you do hydroxide ions, OH minus. You have the same amount of H plus as you have OH minus at pH 7. You know why? Because water has this special ability. Water is able to ionize. What does that mean? A water molecule will pop off a proton and leave behind a hydroxide ion, and only at pH 7 do you have the same amount of hydrogen ion, H plus, as you do hydroxide ion, OH minus. That's why it's called neutral pH. That's the only pH. pH 7 is the only pH where you have the same amount of protons and hydroxide ions. And then what you need to know is, as you go to pH 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0, you're getting more and more acidic. As you go pH 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, you're getting more basic, okay? And here's another thing you need to know. For every step from 7 to 6, for every step that you're going more acidic, the concentration of protons is increasing by 10. So at pH 6, you have 10 times more protons 10 times more proton concentration than at pH 7. At pH 5, you have 100 times more than pH 7. At pH 4, you have 1,000 times more protons. So each step is times 10. So 10 times more protons, 10 times more protons, 10 times more protons. When you're going towards pH 14, you've got 10 times less protons, 10 times less protons, 10 times less protons. Okay, that's an important thing to know about for the exam. Another thing to know is what happens with hydroxide ions. Remember, at pH 7, you have the same amount of protons as hydroxide ions. Well, here's what you need to understand about hydroxide ions. They are inversely proportional to the protons. Inversely proportional. You know what that means? Here. When we went to pH 6, what happened to the protons? From pH 7, we went to pH 6. We have 10 times more protons, right? Well, inversely proportional means hydroxide ions are doing the exact opposite. So if protons are going up by 10, hydroxide ions are going down by 10. So what we could say is at pH 6, you have 10 times more proton concentration, but 10 times less hydroxide ion concentration. And at pH 5, you have, again, another 10 times more protons and another 10 times fewer hydroxide ions. And the opposite is happening as you go towards more basic, as you go to pH 8, pH 9. If you go to pH 8 from pH 7, you have 10 times fewer protons and 10 times more hydroxide ions. So if that makes sense, great, let's move on. If it doesn't, watch this video at the bottom left. But that's the crux of it. That's what you really need to understand for the exam. Okay, what you should understand from here is simply that, yes, again, concentrations of protons and hydroxide ions are the same in pure water. This is pH 7. All of this is actually covered in my video. An acid is a substance that causes an increase in protons in a solution, and that causes the pH to go down. A base is a substance that decreases protons in a solution or increases hydroxide ions in a solution, and that causes the pH to go up toward more basic. These equations here, they're great to understand, but they're not super necessary for the exam. I highlight these concepts in that video from before. All right, so let's keep moving on. What are we looking at here? Now that we've talked about water and why water is so important to life, let's talk a little bit about carbon and why carbon is so important. Carbon is actually very important to life. In fact, have you heard that we are organic creatures or we are carbon-based life forms? Do you know what they mean by that? Well, organic chemistry is actually the study of molecules that have carbon in them. Carbon is the basis of our organic molecules that make up our body, and these molecules include macromolecules, and biomolecules. The biomolecules are the proteins, the nucleic acids, DNA and RNA, the carbohydrates, sugars and starches, right? So you got proteins, nucleic acids, you got carbohydrates, fats and things are also, lipids are all, based on carbon backbones, okay? Carbon is very, very important to understand. So we're going to be talking about carbon and organic molecules. Again, what is an organic molecule? An organic molecule is simply a molecule that contains carbon. And life is based on carbon. Life is based on these organic molecules. Those organic molecules are floating around in water inside of your cells, right? Or when you go on as a student later on and study organic chemistry, you're going to be studying molecules that have carbon in them. That's very, very important. Do you guys remember carbon has 4 valence electrons? Okay, because it has 4 valence electrons, it can form 4 covalent bonds with other atoms. That's good to know. a carbon can bind to 4 partners, which makes it very versatile, doesn't it? How many partners? Let me show you this real quick. This is actually kind of nice to understand. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Why carbon is such a versatile molecule. Okay, let me find my marker. Here it is. So, for example, carbon has 4 valence electrons. So how many partners can it have? Well, 4. So, for example, this is the simplest example here where 4 hydrogens come along and share their electrons. And now you've got CH4 methane. Right? That's nice. If you can bond to 4 partners, you can make some pretty complex shapes, right? Because you could have a long chain of carbons with hydrogens attached. You can have all kinds of stuff, right? What if I'm like oxygen? What if I'm oxygen? How many valence electrons do I have? Look, here I have 6 valence electrons. How many partners can I have? Well, only 2. Look, here's a hydrogen, which brings an electron. Here's a hydrogen, which brings an electron. This is called water, or H2O. Water. So we've got H2O, water, and we've got CH4, methane. Do you see how you could build more complex structures with a carbon that can bind to 4 partners than oxygen, which can bind to 2 partners? What about nitrogen? Remember how many valence electrons? Nitrogen has 5 valence electrons. So how many partners can nitrogen have? 3. So nitrogen can only make like NH3, for example. This is ammonia. So you see how you can't build as complex shapes with nitrogen or oxygen because they can only have 3 or 2 partners respectively, whereas carbon is very versatile. It's abundant on Earth. There's plenty of it. It can make 4 partners. You can make big complex molecules, really long, large biomolecules out of it. So I think that's why carbon is the organic molecule, why life chose carbon as a basis of its biomolecules. Okay, so let's take a look at this here. Here's carbon. I've been drawing it kind of like up, down, left, right, like a plus sign, but it actually looks more like this. Look, the black sphere in the middle is carbon, and the gray spheres would represent hydrogen. So this is CH4 methane. When carbon is making single bonds, it actually adopts this conformation. It looks kind of like a pyramid shape, not a plus sign, not a plus sign. It looks like a pyramid shape. It's got 1 hydrogen sticking out to the back. That's what this dashed line represents. It's got 1 hydrogen kind of coming out at you. That's what this wedge shape represents. And then you've got another hydrogen sticking off to the side, and there's a 109.5 degree angle between them. So it's more like a pyramid shape. So look, here's methane with its pyramid shape. That shape is called tetrahedral shape. And as long as carbon is just making those single bonds, it has a pyramid shape. Okay, here's a more complex hydrocarbon, a more complex molecule with just carbon and hydrogen. It's called C2H6. You've got 2 carbons connected with single bonds to one another, and they're connected to 3 hydrogens each. Remember, how many bonds can carbon make? 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. But as long as you're making single bonds, remember you have a tetrahedral shape, a pyramid shape. Here's a pyramid shape of this carbon. Here's a pyramid shape for the other carbon. Pyramids. But here's the catch. Here's where it kind of gets a little tricky. Look what's happening here. If carbon were to make a double bond, remember a double covalent bond, now suddenly it becomes a flat molecule. It's no longer has its pyramid shape. Why? Because those orbitals are constrained. So you have here, this is a carbon double bond to another carbon. Now the molecule has become what's known as planar or flat. Why? Because of the double bond. Okay. So again, how many bonds can carbon make? 1, 2, 3, 4. You see, it's in this case, it's making 2 bonds with this other carbon. And this carbon's also making 1, 2, 3, 4. Everything checks out. But here, where only single bonds are made, you retain the tetrahedral shape. Here, where you make a double bond, now suddenly stuff gets flattened out into a planar shape. Here's some, just, you don't need to memorize these or anything, but I'm just showing you that here are some even more interesting shapes that you can make, interesting molecules that you can make. You can make these interesting shapes with carbon. You form these ring shapes. This is called cyclopentane. This one's cyclohexane. Pent means 5, so you got 5 carbons in a ring shape here. So carbon can form ring-shaped molecules, or it can form long, long chains as well. Look, here you've got single bonds only. Here you've thrown in some double bonds. So obviously this ring is going to be more of a flat ring, a planar ring. And this ring is going to be more of a dynamic, like up-down, like tetrahedral shape ring. Okay. Here you've got another ring, but here you've got a nitrogen in that ring. So I'm just showing you this slide to show you that you can make all kinds of complex shapes, either linear long chains of carbon, you can form rings of carbon, but either way, you can form really neat shapes with carbon. Now, let me take a little break here because I'm going to go over this slide in more detail, and I'm going to be able to write on this slide, so I'm going to probably attach my tablet to be able to do so. Let me take a small break. I'll come back and explain this slide in a little more detail for you. Break time. All right, everyone. Welcome back from break time. Where I left off, I was going to tell you about these shapes here and something interesting about them. So I pulled up Paint here. I got my little tablet, so hopefully this works. Sometimes I can use my mouse better than I can this little tablet pen. But what I want you to see is these molecules here. You see how you have carbons in this molecule? These carbons, each one is making 4 bonds, right? So look at this carbon here. It's making 4 bonds. Here's a bond to another carbon. Here's a bond to a hydrogen. Here's a bond to another hydrogen. And here's the last bond to another carbon. So you're making 4 total bonds. And remember, carbon can always make 4 total bonds. And all of these carbons are making 4 total bonds. Here as well, each carbon is making 4 bonds. And even when you're making double bonds, look here. This carbon's making 4 total bonds. Look, 1, 2, 3, 4. Carbon can always make 4 bonds. 1, 2, 3, 4. But just don't forget that if it's making a double bond, that counts as 2 out of the 4 bonds. And of course, carbon can also bind to things like nitrogen, and nitrogen can form a double bond as well. But how many bonds can nitrogen make? How many bonds? Do you remember? It has 5 valence electrons. So how many bonds can nitrogen make? It can only make 3 bonds. So it's making 1 here with this carbon and 2 to this carbon over here. So what do I want you to know here? I want you to realize that, first of all of these are called hydrocarbons. This last one has a nitrogen in it. That's why, you see this blue sphere here. But these are all called hydrocarbons. And hydrocarbons means hydrogen and carbon. Molecule made of hydrogen and carbon. And here's something else I need you to understand. And that is that organic chemists don't want to sit around and draw carbons and hydrogens all day, right? These molecules take a long time to draw. So instead, organic chemists have come up with a shorthand version of drawing these things. This is going to help you a lot in this class. It's going to help you a lot in subsequent classes. So what's the shorthand for this molecule on the left? You see this cyclopentane? What's a shorthand way of drawing this? Here it is, okay? I'm going to show it to you and then I'll explain it. Look, cyclopentane, another way of drawing it is simply this. Watch this. Boom, 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 boom. We're done. this, what I crudely drew using my stylus pen here and my little tablet pad. I think I need a better tablet pad. This one's from many years ago. Anyway, that shape I just drew, this here, is the same as writing this all out. You know why? Here's how you decipher it. You see where it comes to a point, these little points here, these vertices. The vertices, the points are carbon. So this is a carbon. You see that? This is a carbon. Anywhere you see a point is a carbon. Look at this. Everywhere you see a point, you assume there's a carbon there. And then you might be wondering, well, Dr. D, how do I know how many hydrogens are attached to the carbons? And why didn't you write those in? Well, because those are like given. They're like assumed, right? So how do you solve? Look, how many bonds can carbon make here, up here? How many bonds can this carbon make? All carbon can always make 4 bonds. You see what I'm saying? And so it's making 1 bond to each of the adjacent carbons. So how many more bonds can it make? It can make 2 more bonds. You see that? It can make a hydrogen bond here and another hydrogen bond here. So now is carbon making 4 bonds? Yes. And what about this carbon? All the other carbons must have 2 hydrogens as well to satisfy the 4 bond requirement. See, each one of these carbons has to be attached to 2 hydrogens because that's just the way it works. Carbon has to be making 4 bonds. So even though I didn't write the hydrogens in, you can assume they are there, right? And they have to equal 4 total bonds. So how would I draw this molecule here next to it, this cyclohexane? How would I draw that? Let me try drawing with my mouse, by the way. Years of gaming. I wonder if my mouse skills are better than my stylus skills. So let me try just drawing this with the... Wow, that is much smoother, actually. I'm way better at writing with my... Even though I'm... Let me side note, I'm sorry. I'm left-handed, but I actually write better with a mouse in my right hand because of years of gaming than I can with a stylus in my left hand. So maybe I'll put the stylus away and just use my mouse. So again, this shape I just drew, this shape, an organic chemist would save a lot of time by drawing this shape over this cyclohexane, you see? Because again, what does each point represent? Each vertice represents a carbon. You see that? Each vertice represents a carbon. Even my C's look better, okay? And how many bonds can carbon make? 2. See, two more bonds because 4 total bonds, right? So this carbon has 4 bonds. 1, 2, 3, 4. This carbon must be making 4 bonds, right? Look at this. Okay, so each one of these carbons must have 2 hydrogens attached. So you just use some deductive reasoning to figure that out. You see. So anyway, that's this molecule here. Now, what happens when you start throwing in double bonds? Like, look at this down here. See this double bond action here? Okay, so how would I draw this molecule? How would I draw that? Well, it's simply like this. Watch. First, I make my general shape. Okay, but notice how there's a double bond here between these 2 carbons. So look what I do here. I denote that by drawing a double line there. And look at this one here. And look at this one here. So when an organic chemist draws this up here, they mean this. They mean benzene. Okay, benzene, you could either write the whole thing out like this, or you can draw this, and it means the same thing. Again, if you wanted to solve it, you could solve it. Everywhere you see a vertice or a point is a carbon. All of these are carbons. Sorry, my handwriting isn't great. And then you just use math to figure out how many hydrogens are attached. So this carbon's making 1, 2 bonds to this carbon, 1 bond to that carbon. So it's already making 3 bonds. So how many more can it make? 1. So it can only have 1 hydrogen. You see how I solved that there? This carbon's already making 2 bonds to this carbon. It's making 1 bond to that carbon. So this carbon can also only be making 1 bond to a hydrogen. So you just, as long as it adds up to 4. See, 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So it has to have another hydrogen. Okay. And what about this ring here, what's the shorthand for this ring? Again, here's what I do. Watch this. Okay, the vertices are C's. Oh, by the way, let me show you something. For this one, you see how there's a nitrogen here? I would actually write that in. Does that make sense? I would write that nitrogen in. So this is how a organic chemist would denote pyridine. Okay, this is you would write the N in there. You know why? Because you only assume the carbons and the hydrogens. If you have any nitrogens in there or oxygens in there or sulfur or whatever, you would write that in. So this is the shorthand for, oh, I'm sorry, and I messed up, right? Where are the double bonds? Here's a double bond. Here's a double bond. And here is a double bond, right? Look at this. Kudos to you if you caught that before I caught it. This is the shorthand for this, okay? This is the shorthand for the last example here. And again, what do you do? Everywhere you see a point or a vertex, you draw in a carbon, okay? And then you solve for hydrogens. And by the way, the vertices, the points are called vertices, and the lines represent the bonds. The lines are called edges. Okay, so how many hydrogens attached to this nitrogen at the top? 0, right? Because look, nitrogen can only make 3 bonds, and it's already making 3 bonds. 2 to this carbon on the right, 1 to this carbon on the left. So there's no hydrogens attached to this nitrogen. But what about this carbon? It's making 1, 2, 3 bonds. So this carbon can have a hydrogen. This carbon also can have 1 hydrogen. So anyway, this is shorthand. This is how organic chemists denote molecules. It's very important to understand. It will help you a lot in not just my class, but in subsequent classes as well. So let's keep going with this. Another thing you need to understand is this concept of isomers. You know what an isomer is? An isomer is when you have the same molecular formula, but different molecular shape. So look at this molecule at the top left, this butane molecule. These two, butane and isobutane, these two are examples of what's called structural isomers. The structure is different, but the makeup is the same. Look, butane has a molecular formula of, you see, how many carbons does it have? 4. C4H10. You see that? This butane is C4H10, and it looks like this. Isobutane is actually also C4H10, but it looks totally different. That's what a structural isomer is. And what you need to understand is, in chemistry, you could have 2 molecules with the same composition, but different structure, and those are called structural isomers, and they're going to have different properties. They're not going to be the exact same in their properties. Geometric isomers are a type of isomer, a type of structural isomer. Geometric isomers are when you're dealing with flat molecules. You see this? You see this flat? Or anytime you're dealing with one side different than another. For example, look at this. Both of these cis-2-butene and trans-2-butene, they are both C2H2CH3 two CH3s, right? So they all have the same component. They all have 2 carbons, 2 hydrogens, and 2 methyl groups. Methyl group means CH3. That's a CH3. That's a CH3. This one also has 2 CH3s. It has 2 carbons and 2 hydrogens. So they have the same building blocks, right? The same molecular formula, but different structure. Okay, so this one here, notice how the methyl groups, the CH3s, are on the same side. That's called the cis isomer. The cis geometric isomer has these methyl groups on the same side. And this is called the trans isomer. Notice how the methyl groups are across from one another. Notice how the methyl groups are across from one another. And don't forget, when carbon forms a double bond like this, that means that the molecule is flat. So this is like a piece of paper, flat. Methyl groups on the same side is going to be different than methyl groups across from one another. And we'll get into what methyl groups are in a little bit. Here's another type of isomer. It's called an enantiomer. This is a special kind of isomer that usually has to do with carbon's tetrahedral shape. Remember its pyramid shape when it's only making single bonds? See, here's a carbon that's attached to a fluorine, a bromine, a chlorine, and a hydrogen. This one on the right is also attached to a fluorine, a bromine, a chlorine, and a hydrogen. So you might think, well, this molecule is this molecule, but these are called the enantiomers. They're called the L isomer or left isomer and the D isomer. That's called the right isomer. D is for dexterous or right. L is for left. Okay, so what's the difference between this isomer and this isomer? They are not the same. You know what enantiomers are? They are molecules that have the same building blocks, but they are mirror images of one another. What do I mean? Mirror images are like your hands. That's why they're called, actually, that's why they're called left and right, because they're kind of like your hands. Mirror images. In the mirror, your hands look identical, right? You know why? Because your hands are superimposable. You see that? It looks like the same thing right now, but is it the same? If I were to take off this hand and that hand and swap them around, would it look normal? No, it would look abnormal. You see what I'm saying? So hands are examples of it, I guess, an enantiomer because they're superimposable. You see that? Superimposable, but are they identical? They are not identical. This hand is not this hand. If you were to swap the hands on opposite wrists, it would not look normal. So look at this here. The only way to make the D enantiomer into the L enantiomer is to pop a couple of these guys off, like hydrogen off and chlorine off, and like swap them out. All right. If you don't pop these off and swap them, you're not going to get the exact same molecule. And a lot of times the L isomer will have some functions or some effects, and the D isomer has its own different properties, especially in drugs. You'll see this a lot in drugs. The L isomer has certain effects in the body, and the D isomer may have no effect in the body. So you have to understand the L and D isomers, the enantiomers. By the way, if you ever go to Sabine Hall, when you're walking into Sabine Hall where the bookstore is and the coffee shop is, you will see two sculptures outside of the doors there, and those are enantiomers. You'll see them. Next time, take a step back and look at those two big molecules at the entrance to the building and appreciate how they are enantiomers of one another. It's kind of fun to do. All right, so moving on, we are talking here about functional groups. All right, functional groups. And functional groups, you can think of them as little molecular attachments that you would stick onto a carbon backbone, and those little attachments give properties to that carbon backbone. So for example, this is just an example. Here are two molecules. This one on the left is called estradiol or estrogen, and the one on the right is called testosterone, right? These are hormones in the human body, right? But obviously they're slightly different and they have different effects. You get different characteristics with estrogen in your body and different characteristics with more testosterone in your body because they have different hormone receptors. These are hormones in your body, and they are different hormones. But look how similar they are. Notice how both of them have these 4 fused carbon rings. You see this? This is 4 fused carbon rings. And by the way, can you figure out how to solve this now that I told you how organic chemistry works? Can you solve this? Do you see why I say they have carbon backbones? They both have carbon backbones. Do you know how to solve that? Let's hop over real quick. Let's do this together. Let me go back to my Paint program here. Okay, I'm in Paint. Do you guys remember how to do this? Look, each one of these points is what? Each vertex, each point is a carbon, right? So you could actually sit there and draw the carbons in if you wanted to, and you could solve this whole molecule. Do you see how this will help you so much when you're taking OChem or chemistry or biochemistry? This is going to help you a lot, and it's going to help you in my class. Because sometimes in textbooks they just draw these structures and there's nothing to them. There's just a bunch of lines, and you're sitting there going, how am I supposed to figure out, how this molecule works and what's in this molecule if it's just a bunch of sticks? Well, now you see each one of those vertices, each one of those points is a carbon. You see that? There's a carbon here. 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 And a carbon here. So this is what I mean by organic backbone. You see, these hormones have organic backbones. They have carbon backbones. You see that? And in this example, these hormones have 4 fused rings, 4 rings of carbon. Okay, and do you know how to solve for the hydrogens? Just a side note. So for example, this carbon here has how many hydrogens attached? Well, it looks like it's making 1 bond to this carbon, 1 bond to that carbon. So this carbon must have 2 hydrogens attached. I mean, you could sit here and fill in all the hydrogens. Here's a tricky one. Here's a tricky one. This carbon here, look at this carbon here I'm circling. How many hydrogens does it have attached to it? Look, it's making 1 bond to this carbon, 1 bond to that carbon, but it's making 2 bonds to this other carbon. So guess what? This carbon would have 0 hydrogens attached because it's already making 4 bonds. But what about, I don't know, this carbon here? Look at this carbon here. It's making a bond, another bond. So this carbon would have 1 hydrogen attached. Anyway, I'm just showing you how organic chemistry works. And this is what I mean by 4 fused rings. This is called the carbon backbone. This is the carbon backbone. But do you see these other little attachments real quick? Look at this. In red, I'm going to circle some of these attachments I'm talking about. Look at this attachment. Look at this molecular attachment. Look at this little attachment. Look at this little attachment. This one. This one. This one. These are little attachments. Little molecular attachments. You've attached these things to the organic backbone. And guess what? Those attachments give properties to that molecule. The fact that you have this OH here, this CH3 here, this OH there, this O double bond here, this CH3 here, this CH3 here, this OH there, all of these are giving properties to the organic molecule. Okay, that's what a functional group is. Okay, you see where it says here functional groups. Okay, chemical groups, functional groups. That's what they're talking about. Okay, so here is a list of the functional groups. There's the hydroxyl group, the methyl group, carbonyl group, carboxyl group, amino group, phosphate group, and sulfhydryl group. Again, what are these? What are these groups? These are little attachments like these I just told you about, little attachments to your carbon backbone. And each one gives a different property to the molecule. So look at this. This one, for example, is called the hydroxyl group. It's when you have an OH, an O and an H attached to your carbon backbone. Do you see that anywhere here? Do you have a hydroxyl group? Yes, look at this. Here's a hydroxyl group. Here's a hydroxyl group. And here's a hydroxyl group. So estrogen has 2 hydroxyl groups. Testosterone has 1. Okay? And by the way, some people get confused. They say this is OH, but look at this one. This is HO. They say, well, how is that a hydroxyl group? Why isn't it written OH? Very simple explanation. It's because they don't want you to get confused, so they confuse you. They say the H is connected to the O, and the O is connected to this carbon here. Does that make sense? Only the oxygen can make 2 bonds. So if they wrote OH, it would look like the O is connected to the H and H is connected to the carbon. So a lot of times when functional groups appear on the left-hand side of a molecule, they'll write it backwards, right? Just to make it clear that the H is connected to the O and the O is connected to the C. So I'll give you one more example real quick. Look at this. Do you remember here where I said CH3? This is called the methyl group, CH3. Well, this is also a methyl group, but it's written H3C. You know why? They just wanted to make it clear that the H's are connected to the C, and the C is connected to the backbone. So this is called the methyl group, but this is the same thing. It's just written backwards because it's on the left side of the molecule. Anyway, so the first functional group is called the hydroxyl group. It is when you have an OH or maybe written HO connected to your backbone. This is special because it makes you an alcohol, and alcohols usually end in -ol. Okay, so technically, look, estradiol. Estrogen's technically an alcohol, and actually testosterone is actually also technically an alcohol, though it doesn't end in -ol. And here's an example, ethanol. Ethanol, you have an OH here, so this is drinking alcohol. And by the way, ethanol can mix with water. You know why? Because the hydroxyl group is a polar group. There's actually a slight positive charge on this hydrogen. So water can actually mix with this molecule. But guess what? If you didn't have the hydroxyl group there, water wouldn't mix with this molecule. You know why? Because it's all C's and H's. But because you have this polar functional group attached to ethanol, water can mix with it and water can dissolve it. So if you want to know more about that, I go into a little more about that here. Click here on this in your lecture handout in your PDF, and you can watch a longer video on alcohols and hydroxyl functional groups. The carbonyl group. The carbonyl group is an O double bond to the backbone, right? O double bond to backbone. Do you see any here? Do you see any carbonyl groups here? Here it is, O double bond to the carbon backbone. Yes, there it is, right there. So estrogen does not have a carbonyl group, but testosterone does have a carbonyl group. So let's go into carbonyl groups. Again, you have O double bond, and here's something you need to understand. Ketone carbonyl groups are when the O double bonds to a carbon, and that carbon has a carbon on each side. Aldehyde carbonyl groups are when you have O double bond carbon, but that carbon only has a carbon on one side, not both sides. So knowing that, which one is this? Is this a ketone carbonyl group or an aldehyde carbonyl group? Cue the Jeopardy music. It is a ketone carbonyl group because the O double bond to C, that C has a C on each side. See, that carbon has a carbon on each side. So this is a ketone carbonyl group. So please do understand the difference between ketone and aldehyde carbonyl groups. If you want more information about that, click on this. I go into a little bit more depth. Carboxyl groups. Carboxyl groups look like this. There's an O double bond and an OH bond to the same carbon. So you have a carbonyl group and a hydroxyl group both connected to the same carbon. In that case, it's called a carboxyl group. And the special thing about carboxyl groups is that they are called acidic functional groups. What does that mean? When you place a molecule that has a carboxyl group attached, when you place that in water, it becomes ionized. It releases the protons. So you see this H right here? You see that H right there? It actually pops off, but not the whole H, just the proton pops off, and the proton floats around, making the solution more acidic. Remember, more protons means more acidic. So acetic acid, for example, has a carboxyl group, so that's why it's an acid. Anything with a carboxyl group is an acid, okay? Why? Because when you place it in water, it pops off a proton and it makes the solution more acidic. So if you want more information on that, please click on this link. Amino groups look like this. You have N with two H's, okay? Nitrogen attached to hydrogens. If we look here, amino groups are basic functional groups. You know why? Because if you put an amino group or a molecule like glycine, if you put this into water, look what it does. It takes a proton from the water and it holds on to it. So this becomes CH3, CH3 plus actually, CH3 plus. So because molecules when you put these molecules that have amino groups, when you put them in water, because they take a proton from the water and sequester it, you decrease the number of protons in the solution and it becomes more basic. So if you want more information on why amino groups are basic, please click this for more information. But amino groups, what you need to understand is what they look like, and you need to understand that they are basic functional groups. Okay, then you have sulfhydryl groups. So you have sulfur and hydrogen, a sulfhydryl group attached to your carbon backbone. This makes you polar. So sulfhydryl groups are polar, but more importantly, you need to understand this. When a sulfhydryl group on one molecule comes into contact with the sulfhydryl group on another molecule, you can actually form what's known as a sulfur-sulfur bridge, a disulfide bridge, which is a covalent bond. Sulfhydryl groups covalent bond with other sulfhydryl groups. You need to understand that sulfhydryl groups, when two sulfhydryl groups come into contact, they form covalent bonds, strong covalent bonds called disulfide bridges between them. For example, this is why your hair is curly or straight. Cysteine here, you see this cysteine is a protein, amino acid, I should say, in your amino acid in your body. And people with straight hair have fewer cysteine amino acids in their hair protein. So those proteins, those sulfhydryl groups don't form bonds to one another and their hair remains straight. People with curly hair have more of this amino acid cysteine in their hair proteins. So when those sulfhydryl groups come into contact, they actually form a covalent bond, a disulfide bond, and that causes the curling of those hair proteins and the hair itself. So it's pretty interesting stuff. We're going to be talking about these functional groups in more detail. What else? So you see here, this here is called a phosphate group. Oh, and by the way, again, as always, click on this if you want more information about sulfhydryl groups. I go into more information about all of these. If any of this seems confusing, go ahead and click the Dr. D icon at the bottom left on the handouts. And there's another longer video talking about each and every one of these functional groups. The phosphate group, here you have a phosphorus with 4 oxygens attached to your carbon backbone. This is called a phosphate group, and a phosphate group is negatively charged. If a phosphate group is at the end of a molecule like this, it's going to have 2 negative charges. If there's a phosphate group sandwiched inside of a molecule, it's going to have 1 negative charge. Okay, and why are phosphate groups important besides the fact that they are charged functional groups? Well, you see them on things like DNA and RNA, and phosphate groups are very important in molecules like ATP, and we're going to be learning about all this later on. And also, proteins can gain functional groups to get activated. It's called phosphorylation. They can lose phosphate groups and become deactivated. That's called dephosphorylation. So later on, it's going to become very clear why phosphate groups are so important. And do you remember this one, the methyl group? CH3, the methyl group, is when you have carbon with 3 hydrogens attached to your carbon backbone. Okay, do you see one here? Do you see a methyl group here? Yes, look. Here's a methyl group on testosterone. Here's another methyl group. So what you could say is there's 2 methyl groups of testosterone, whereas estrogen has 1 methyl group. Okay, so you could circle those and call them methyl groups. Now here's what I need you to know about methyl groups. Is this going to be a polar or charged functional group, or do you think this is a non-polar functional group? Well, think about it. Do you remember carbons and hydrogens? That's going to form non-polar covalent bonds. So yeah, this would actually be called a non-polar functional group. Out of all the functional groups I just covered, this is the only non-polar functional group. Okay, so when you see this group, it's a non-polar functional group, CH3. And don't forget, if you write a CH3 on this side of a molecule, it would be called H3C. And as always, if you want more information about the methyl group, click this icon in the lecture handouts. Okay, I hope this helps. This is the end of Chapter 2, Part 2. I know it's a long chapter, but this really is a crash course on chemistry, all the way from the beginning of what is matter, what are the elements, what is an atom, all the way up to how molecules form. We talked about bonds, covalent bonds, ionic bonds, hydrogen bonds. We talked about water, the properties of water, everything from cohesion, adhesion to pH, and so forth and so on. Then we talked about carbon, all about how carbon works and how it's a versatile molecule that can make 4 bonds. And then we talked about isomers. We talked about how organic chemists write shorthand. Then we talked about the organic molecules. We talked about functional groups. And I promise you, this was not all in vain. Learning about this stuff was not in vain. It's not something you just have to kind of memorize and move on and not see again. I promise you, you're going to see these concepts over and over again this semester. So please learn them the best you can. Please understand this. This is a challenging chapter, and that's why I spent a lot of time on it. I really need you to get into the nitty-gritty and learn this stuff. But thank you for watching. Pretty soon I'll have a chapter 3 posted up for you. Thanks for watching, and tune in next time.